I would like to begin my reflections on mimicry with a quotation. And in these lines, Walter Benjamin very vividly describes the experience of suddenly perceiving previously unrecognized and deceptive similarities in connection with the experience of reading texts by Marcel Proust. He transposes them into the image of mimicry, in which similarities are instantaneously illuminated in the moment in which they have already been extinguished. In other words, in the moment in which they have already been constellated otherwise and are thereby in the process of disappearing in order to become distinguishable. And I think this is what I wrote down. It's a quote for you, because it's about movement. I quote, "Proust's most accurate, most conclusive insights fasten on their objects the way insects fasten on leaves, blossoms, branches, betraying nothing of their existence until a leap, a beating of wings, a vault, show the startled observer that some incalculable individual life has imperceptibly crept into an alien world," unquote. Now one might object that this is a matter of mimesis in the biological sense. Mimesis in biology means camouflage. It consists in causing those signs that would be helpful for a predator to recognize its prey to recede into background noise. And this is the famous theory of Wickler. In mimicry, on the other hand, the receiver indeed recognizes the object but falsely interprets it. More precisely, we are concerned in this quotation with both phenomena. And this allows us to touch upon a necessary condition for the investigation of mimicry. Namely, mimicry cannot be regarded simply as such, but always exists in relation to a particular receiver and his interests. This can be nicely illustrated by the example cited. As Wolfgang Wickler, one of the most prominent German researchers of mimicry, shows, for some signal-bearing structures, there are in fact different signal recipients with divergent interests. On this assumption, different systems of understanding can be connected with the same signal sender. The Hymenopus mantis, or better known as the praying mantis, which resembles a flower in coloration and body shape, for instance, is, with respect to an insect-eating bird, disguised as a flower structure, and so uninteresting for the bird, and is thus an example of mimesis. But it appears to a nectar-seeking insect as a promising source of sustenance. From this perspective, it is an example of mimicry. Let us thus stick to mimicry and its connection to the communicative or semiotic concept of the signal. In his Dictionary of Biology, Günter Tembrock defines mimicry as a faked signal, that is, as, I quote, "the innate imitation of a living model in appearance and behavior by utilizing signal functions," unquote. Mimicry can therefore be understood as a tactic that seeks, through strengthening similarity, to hide what is dissimilar. A dissimilar thing that always also remains visible in a particular regard, but which, on account of other semiotic characteristics, is not at first perceived. If one speaks here of innate imitation, then this also implies that the concept of mimicry can be sensibly applied outside of biology only as a biological metaphor, since we apply mimicry to the sphere of cultural studies in order to designate precisely not an evolutionarily and biologically programmed disguise, but deliberate acts. This might be discussable, but this is what my aim is to say. In mimicry, in cultural studies, we have to deal with deliberate acts, not involuntary or unconscious acts. Against this backdrop, the task for cultural studies thus consists in defining how and why the biological term mimicry can also be appropriately, that is in a sufficiently distinct sense, used for cultural phenomena. This is, in my opinion, only possible if this term promises to name a particular characteristic that distinguishes mimicry from mimesis, understood here in the sense of artistic imitation. With regard to this, my suggestion would be to use the concept of a cultural mimicry, as it were, in order to bring into view the moment in which the deception of a third is seen through. A moment that is, in certain regard, also presupposed by the model of mimicry in biology, but is not reflected upon. For in this context, it is necessary to keep present before us the fact that we, unlike the classical signal receiver in nature, can speak of mimicry, can reflect upon it, But I learned in the break that there are kind of different in-betweens. The fact that we have recognized the deception, our own or that of others, a competence that one cannot impute to the insect seeking nourishment which falls into the trap of the mantis. I would like to explain this through the remarks of Wickler, who in his reflections very lucidly both argues from the perspective of the receiver and thoroughly accounts for the perspective of the observer in his definition of the model and the imitator. The consequences, I quote Wickler, of the reaction for the receiver define the model and the imitator. He adduces advantages from his reaction to the model as one, disadvantages from the same reaction to the imitator as two. For the imitator as two, the reaction of the receiver is beneficial, unquote. I add, however, that all of these things can only be described if one can observe the situation from an epistemological observer position E2, that is, grasp the mimicry as such. A vantage point that E1 cannot per definitionem occupy. Mimicry could thus always be meaningfully employed as a concept when one sees through a situation oneself in which another unknowingly falls prey to a deception. This would be kind of my minimal definition of mimicry. Formulated system theoretically, an observer E2 thus becomes a second-order observer insofar as he observes how observers observe and subsequently critically reflects upon this. In Art as a Social System, Newman explains that, I quote, second-order observation observes only how others observe. Once the question how is posed, a characteristic difference between first and second-order observation comes into view. The first-order observer concentrates on what he observes, experiences, and acts out within a horizon of relatively sparse information. By contrast, the second-order observer can comprehend more extended realms of selectivity and identify contingencies where the first-order observer believes he's following a necessary path or is acting entirely naturally. If one approaches Forgeries with this model of mimicry, the very interesting double perspective is clearly shown. Because, regarded historically, a forgery, in order to be constituted as one at all must always first have successfully deceived a particular personnel in order to be uncovered later, perhaps decades afterward. Moreover, we, not as biologists, but as practitioners of cultural studies, can draw certain conclusions from this deferred reaction and, for example, inquire as to why the forgery initially entrapped people, although in certain cases it is revealed ex post to be an extremely deficient imitation. In other words, as second-order observers, we are in a position to read two perspectives simultaneously and to compare these with one another. A, the forgery as undiscovered original from the perspective of the deceived contemporaries, and B, the forgery as forgery from our perspective. From this critical viewpoint, a forgery can then serve for us in retrospect as a sort of unplanned experiment using a decoy, which helps us in cultural studies as researchers of behavior to recognize which signals in the process of forgery have ensured that someone, E1, has fallen into the trap. That is, we can ask ourselves and observe critically which prominent characteristics, criteria, and contextualizations participated in the forgeries being believed and perceived as authentic. This also leads to an interesting and disquieting insight, since, before its discovery, the forgery still counted as genuine and original. Wouldn't the criteria mentioned be identical with those which at that time would have legitimated or certified something like the conception of an original? By means of the forgery, as an experiment using a decoy, we could, for example, work out how at a particular historical time something was defined or put to work as genuine, original, authentic, authorized, factive, etc. To put it differently, against the backdrop of my methodological reflections, we can establish that the genuine artifact or epistemic object passed off as self-explanatory is also the object of practices that create it as authentic or factive. These practices are made just as apparent with regard to forgeries, and they can be exposed and worked out through second-order observation. In my dissertation, however, and I wrote on the margins of my text that this is the time for a commercial break. In my dissertation, moreover, but it's already passed around, I pursued the question of how the observational criteria and viewpoints that I have mentioned are changed by the discovery of the forgery. What is significant in this context is above all the special case in which one discovers one's own deception ex post, or at least experiences the discovery as one of those affected by it. Then one, as E1, the upper part, formerly deceived by the forgery, can be forced into the critical perspective E2 of second-order observation with corresponding consequences in the respective discourse. In view of the basic theme of the conference, which does not concentrate, I quote, on the processes of concealment and revelation in phenomena of mimicry, I will let this remain in the background. However, I would like to once again emphasize that the discovery is a necessary epistemological condition for us from the position E2 to be able to regard mimicry as mimicry. Otherwise, our perspective would be reduced to that of the little fish who, suspecting nothing, approaches the turtle and greedily snaps at the worm-like protuberances at the tip of its tongue, and thus naturally runs the risk of being eaten. Or, considered through the coordinates of forgery, we would not even be capable of speaking of forgeries, but without the discoveries, without the knowledge of the deception, we would always have to speak of an original, since every forgery must appear as such prior to its discovery. Once again, please do not understand me falsely. I'm by no means someone who wishes to celebrate the idea of the original, of the authentic here. I would like only to submit for consideration that every speaking of forgery also automatically contains ex negativo some particular representation of the authentic. Phrased differently, without the idea of an original, of the factive or authentic, speaking of forgeries makes no sense. That is, every time one speaks of a forgery, certain ideas of the original, factive, authentic are automatically brought to bear. Representations that one can then analyze as a practitioner of cultural studies interested in the history of science. To illustrate my abstract suggestion, and I hope thus to prove that the model can be sensibly applied, I would like to present my reflections on the double phenomenon of forgery as original and as forgery, using the example of the so-called Piltdown man. A forgery that is particularly interesting because its discovery occurred over a period of 41 years, and a great number of the researchers who had participated, at least the ones who were still alive, could in retrospect no longer understand how nearly the entire expert population of the discipline of paleoanthropology could have been deceived. So we turn to the Piltdown man. On December 18, 1912, Arthur Smith Woodward, conservator of the Geological Division of the British Museum, and Charles Dawson, a lawyer as well as an amateur geologist and scholar of ancient history, presented in the lecture hall of the London Geological Society the remains of a man from the fog of prehistory, which had been dug up in an excavation site near Piltdown. The left part of a lower jawbone resembling that of an ape with 2 molars and human skull fragments. The advanced age of the relics, they were dated by Dawson to the Pleistocene era, it's about 2.3 million to 10,300 years before our time, was above all attested by the depth of the excavation layer, as well as by the presence nearby of animal remains and simple stone tools from particular recognized geological periods. The discovery was baptized in honor of its finder Dawson, Eoanthropus dawsoni, Eoanthropus because dawn man, because it manifested the birth of present-day man. Although the decisive anatomical proof that the human skull and the ape-like jaw belonged together, namely the joint between jaw and cranium, was missing, Dawson and Smith Woodward concluded, primarily on the basis of external geological and stratigraphic considerations, that is because the fragments were found in immediate proximity to, and in the same time-specific layer as datable, animal, teeth, and tools. Moreover, the appearance of both finds seemed to match in size and coloration. And here you see the brown parts are the found ones, and the rest is reconstruction. So you see how they are in discordance. How can this forgery be analyzed in accordance with my second-order observation mimicry theory? In other words, how can one shed light on why the fossils were accepted by the scientific discourse of paleoanthropology at the time as genuine and conclusive? The first step is to work out, using the statements of experts regarding the forgery, the scientific methods for investigating paleontological objects generally accepted at the time. For the Piltdown man achieved its evidentiary status, on the one hand, against the backdrop of historically specific paleontological practices, on the other hand, because it left sufficient empty space on account of its fragmentary character to serve as a projection surface for theoretical expectation. In addition, the forgery took place during a phase of evolutionary research in which as yet unproven speculations about the ancestry and development of man were finally supposed to be factually confirmed. With regard to this, it should be emphasized that it is not only the false facts themselves and their apparently authentic heritage, but above all the discursification, the scientific claims of genuineness and the theoretical conclusions coupled to them, that should be held responsible for the effects of the forgery. If one follows Dawson's account, according to which the workers at the excavation site initially took the remains of the skull to be a thing like a cocoa nut, then it is conceivable that they, like other excavated materials, could have simply landed in a waste heap or been used as rubble for construction in the street. Explained once more through the mimicry model, it appeared only to the group of specialized scientists, E1, not as any old object, but as a paleontologically relevant find. And only on the basis of its incorporation into the discourse of paleontology, along with those of the associated scientific fields of geology and anatomy, in connection with the renowned institution of the British Museum as well as the authorized specialists associated with it, was the artifact able to yield the corresponding effects. What was, above all, decisive in this regard was the transfer of ownership of the find to the geologist and paleontologist Smith Woodward, who was in fact elected to the Royal Society in 1901. Smith Woodward was one of the luminaries of the discipline at the time and, during the Piltdown discoveries, was initially vice president and then subsequently even president of the Geological Society. In contrast, those scientists who doubted the authenticity of the Piltdown man occupied only a marginal position with regard to the paleontological informational web, because the majority of other learned scholars came out in support of its authenticity sooner or later. A.C. Hinton, one of the researchers at the lower end of the hierarchical chain, declared soon after the discovery of the forgery, the thought, I quote, that the jaw and tooth were recent specimens and not fossils, of course, could never enter our minds, for the material had been accepted by the geological department as fossil, unquote. Some amateurs on the periphery of these disciplines indeed vehemently questioned the authenticity of the Piltdown man, but they had, both institutionally and in terms of the discipline, subordinate speaker status in comparison to its supporters. The forgery did not, however, develop its potential because certain authorities made claims for its authenticity that were without scientific basis. The affirmative claims indeed carried greater weight in the institutional network because these scientists, with their status, had access to the appropriate rituals of presentation and possibilities for publication, the meetings or technical journals of the Geological Society. But the judgments of the experts also legitimated themselves against the backdrop of to call it with Foucault, historical a priori, that is, against the backdrop of previous excavations and the concepts that were based on them. Since knowledge of the ape-like characteristics of human forebears already existed through the fossils of the Homo heidelbergensis, 1907, this was seen as a precursor of the Neanderthal man and of the Java man, these were taken as models in order to make it seem more plausible that the Piltdown man was older, because he looked more ape-like. In addition, the comparatively deeper geological layer in which the later fossil was excavated substantiated this dating. The fact that a whole skull was reconstructed out of a few small fragments, the brown ones, did not appear questionable to the researchers because of the limited number of finds available at the time. The potentially undermining parts were left out. One could say in retrospect that the imagination, Einbildung, also in the sense of the capacity of a picturing as one, in Einsbilden, of the participating researchers was sufficiently nourished by the only partially perfectly faked remains. The partly genuine animal fossils and authentic layers of sediment, in conjunction with the agreement in color among all the elements, thus secured an initial context in which the anthropoid bones would be read as one. In considering the scientific image with which the 1914 geological discussion was illustrated, it should be emphasized that the skull fragments were already reproduced as a totality in situ. Revealingly, against the backdrop of their preconceptions, the researchers even adduced attributes that were not demonstrable in the faked artifacts themselves, so that, leaving aside the manipulated properties, ape-like characteristics were attributed to the human skull, and human traits were attributed to the jaw of the ape. Thus, an exemplar provided the criteria of evaluation to its complementary part. As background for the acceptance of the ape man, however, one must take into account not only the actually excavated forms, but also theories involving morphologies that had been hypothetically generated. Here Charles Darwin can be regarded as the leading figure. If one examines the relevant passages in The Descent of Man, one notices that Darwin did not merely support the above-mentioned hopes of a missing link, but that the forgery was in point of fact prefigured theoretically. In his 1882 reflections on the descent of man, Darwin assumed slow, gradual changes in species. He thus viewed the ancestral chains of man and man-ape as having a common ancestor. Man developed from this common ancestor from some imprecisely delimited time onwards through the additive accumulation of many small deviations, whose hereditary transmission was determined through natural selection in the struggle for existence. This was Darwin in one sentence. But as stated, this theory was missing the final and unequivocal proof, a fossil connecting link. However, Darwin had made specific scientific speculations regarding its possible content, some of which are particularly relevant in the context of the reconstructed morphology of the Eoanthropus dawsoni. For instance, he writes that within the hereditary chain of human ancestry, over the course of evolution, the jaw and teeth gradually grew smaller. Thus, in the examination of the Piltdown man, a correspondingly high signal function was accorded to the teeth. That is, in light of the theoretical background of Darwin's speculations, the relatively small anthropoidal molars that had been found appeared to bear unequivocal witness to the transition that had commenced from Eoanthropus to man. With regard to the canines, Darwin likewise develops a morphological image. The canine is the Ekzahn. This is a little bit special vocabulary. The males had great canine teeth, writes Darwin, which served them as formidable weapons. In the context of the Piltdown forgery, it was therefore to be regretted that the set of teeth did not contain any canines. But this factual hole was likewise closed when, on August 30, 1913, after further excavations near the first site, Teilhard de Chardin discovered a tooth which corresponded almost exactly to the expected ape-human figure. And it's already part of the reconstruction. In this tooth, which ought to have occasioned mistrust because of the exactness of its fit, one saw, as it were, the missing link of the missing link, because it had a humanoid structure and thus provided a further argument that the ape jaw and human skull belonged together. Until then, proof of this was still missing, except for the supposition regarding coloration and the specifics of the excavation site. As a result, many critical voices who did not, of course, doubt the authenticity of the fossils, but did proceed from the assumption that they represented two different kinds of creatures, were convinced. In addition, the Piltdown Man perfectly proved the widely disseminated thesis that the history of mankind began not with an upright gait, but with the expansion of the brain, and that other bodily modifications followed afterwards. Precisely this early intelligent appearance of the human being could now be confirmed by one of the fragments of the front skull or by one of the insights concerning the high forehead of the Anthropus, supposedly inductively won from the observation of facts. By means of this method of proof, one can show clearly the extent to which the desired representation for the very early development of human intelligence ensured that only particular characteristics of the Piltdown find would be regarded in the context of previous excavations. On the other hand, discrepancies, signs that also could have led to the earlier exposure of the artifacts, were indeed interpreted as evidence for its uniqueness. In virtue of the false anatomical signifying characteristics of the ape-human jaw, in connection with the additional external plausibility concerning its age, lent to it by the geological stratum and the fossils of mammals attested in the environs, it was concluded that the Piltdown Man must have been alive before any of the proto-humans known at the time. The attributes that would run counter to this calculation of hypothetical continuity, for instance, the aspects of the skull, high forehead, flat brow ridge, that were far more human than those of the Heidelberg or Java man, were left unaccounted for by this calculation of age. On the basis of this dating, which was already considered certain, they were even regarded as a sign that an early vanguard of intelligent life had already existed. I hope this is not too complicated to kind of which kind of data were skipped and which kind of data were seen. The scientific processes surrounding the Piltdown Man thus let it emerge clearly that contrary to the discipline's postulated self-understanding, the fragmentary facts were made to conform to the theory. They became facts counter to the apparently inviolable scientific method of starting with data and then drawing conclusions from it, because they could be perfectly incorporated into already existing theories, explanations, and interpretations. A reply by Arthur Keith makes clear this discursive double bind located in a field of tension between an explicitly formalized research activity and the actual practice of science. With an irony that is unavoidable from today's perspective, he reproaches a critic with precisely the error that most of the apologists for the Piltdown Man committed. I quote, "That is one way of getting rid of facts which do not fit into a preconceived theory. The usual way pursued by men of science is not to get rid of facts, but frame theory to fit them. That is what I propose to do." But because nearly all paleontologists of the time made this mistake, one can conclude that it should by no means be judged as a sole deviation from generally accepted scientific norms, but that the mistake was instead implicitly the standard. In 1915, 2 miles away from the first excavation site, the remains of another prehistoric man, Piltdown II, were found. This pacified most of the paleontologists and anatomists who had continued to doubt the Piltdown Man, or moreover had doubted the complementarity of the skull and jaw. Since the second forgery expanded the context of authentication of the first, the fact that the set of teeth and the skull had been found in the same geological stratum, first found, could be a coincidence. That, in addition, an ape-human canine tooth should be found by chance was less likely, second found. And that a short distance from the site of this find a further exemplar of the Piltdown Man should be unearthed exceeded the laws of probability, third found. Little by little, a corollary space of forged facts and assumptions based upon them was thereby constituted, so that further artifacts were being constantly acknowledged as genuine. Each time that an Eoanthropus fragment was accepted as genuine and was added to the corpus, the context of verification was strengthened, and potential reservations concerning the authenticity of further finds was gradually rendered impossible. Proof by a stochastic probability, thus a relational, if not an absolute method of proof, can be shown to be the governing criterion of the time for authenticity. That is, for the substantiation of scientific knowledge in general. The probability, which increased with the growing number of finds that the skull and jaw fragments belong together, simultaneously led to an assumption concerning the verisimilitude of the first man from Piltdown, which had previously still been viewed as an, I quote, improbable monster. The case of forgery does not, however, only make clear that the prepared artifacts, as was emphasized ex post by the researchers who investigated the forgery, satisfy the methodological requirements of paleontology at the level demanded by the time. It also made clear that already existing methods of testing and alternative theories simply remained unconsidered. Among these were, for instance, the science of mutations, developed in 1900 by Hugo de Vries and others, a science that is not compatible with Darwin's explanations of the development of species as consisting in slow, gradual changes linked to natural selection in the struggle for survival. In other words, by using this science, or the knowledge of mutation, the search for the gapless hereditary gene of humankind, which would attest to this gradual change, would have been made obsolete. In addition, certain methods of control were not employed because of the researchers' wish for the spectacular discovery to be true. For the forgery was not, as many researchers apologetically opined, perfectly carried out in all its elements. While the coloration was indeed nearly incontrovertible according to the contemporary standards of chemical analysis, the stone tools were only crudely carved and the molars roughly filed. And these could have been recognized with the possibilities for microscopic analysis that were available at the time. Wilfrid Le Cros-Clark, one of the three researchers who participated in the final disclosure, later remarked on the traces of scratching on the teeth, I quote, "The evidences of artificial abrasion immediately sprang to the eye. Indeed, so obvious did they seem, it may well be asked, how was it that they had escaped notice before? This question can be very easily answered against the backdrop of the definition of mimicry provided at the beginning. The similarities of the fossils to the anticipated hypothetical morphologies that were perceived by researchers at the time as signals caused the dissimilarities, the indicators of forgery, to be hidden or to recede into the background. This overlooking did not only result, however, from the fact that researchers at the time were accustomed to concentrating primarily on other aspects that appeared decisive in the context of existing theories. It was also due to the change in media, inextricably connected with this, to which the excavations were subject. For most of the researchers only gained entry to the safe, preserving the valuable originals with difficulty or for a short time, and thus supported the results using the plaster casts prepared by the British Museum. These ensured, on the one hand, the homogenization of the disparate parts, and thereby supported the thesis of complementarity. On the other hand, they did not allow for any conclusions to be drawn concerning the numerous manipulations, because the minimal indications for these were not reproduced. As facts, the replicas were thus already themselves the result of a particular, historically specific gaze, which primarily centered on the superficial relations of magnitude, so that particular theoretical results were thereby supported. A process which, as if in a feedback loop, had already influenced the production of the object to be observed. In other words, because only certain signal-bearing structures were reproduced, the copies were already imprinted with particular patterns of interpretation, and thus inevitably confirmed the expectations. With this, the skull, taken as a genuine find, wrote the history of science for 40 years. The history of paleontology, however, would not be complete without also telling the story of its exposure. And with this, I would like to conclude. In the course of time, paleontological science was transformed to the disadvantage of the Piltdown man. In the 1930s and 40s, above all, subsequent prehistoric men were excavated in China, Java, and South Africa, and they appear to prove precisely the opposite of the Eoanthropus quintessences. Although dated to earlier periods, they were characterized by ape-like skulls and human jawbones. Once again, a method of stochastic probability was followed, with the result that the other finds purely numerically render the Dawn Man less plausible. Finally, in 1953, against this backdrop, and after many detours, a newer study of the original was undertaken, in which Joe S. Wiener once again analyzed the different aspects more precisely and was led to suspect forgery. After the first indications of forgery, traces of a file on the teeth were found. He and Kenneth P. Oakley, operating according to the explicit rules of their science, namely with probabilities, attempted to demonstrate that the fossils might owe their appearance to a manipulation by producing numerous faked Piltdown relics with the tools that were suspected. In Wiener's words, to fake the fake. Forgery and research activity were thereby united, for with these scientifically faked pieces of evidence, it was possible to procure permission for further chemical analysis. With the help of the new dating that resulted from the more recent measurements, the structure of the individual elements of proof, which had perfectly supplemented as well as reciprocally supported one another, making the whole thing more plausible, collapsed onto itself. First, it was established that the jawbone belonged to a present-day female orang-utan. After the other Piltdown bones had been redated and de-authenticated, the archaeological surroundings followed, the tools and finally the remainders of the fauna from the Pleistocene. All of these had been artificially made to conform to the color of the geological surroundings, and not a single exemplar, in fact, came from the region of Piltdown. By this point, the forgery as forgery however, had weighty consequences for the scientific field, because the practice of paleoanthropological research activity had been consumed by it over the course of several decades, and had been steered in a false direction, as Wiener summarizes in his book. I quote him, "This ill-begotten form of primitive man in the several hundred papers devoted to him received nearly as much attention as all the legitimate specimens in the fossil record put together." Unquote. For this reason, he commented on the exposure as follows, and with this I would like in fact to conclude: the end of Piltdown Man is the end of the most troubled chapter of human paleontology. Thank you.